Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Pinchback, and I am the owner and founder of Dyslexia On Demand, the premier provider of one-on-one web-based dyslexia therapy. Tonight, I'm coming to you with a PowerPoint with the purpose of educating educators with what dyslexia looks like in the classroom and what you can do for your students directly in order to help them out. So I'm going to go ahead and get the PowerPoint started. I'm going to ask in your grace if I am tripping up over words, as I am just recording this myself. All right. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and start out by talking about the myths about dyslexia. So obviously, go ahead and feel free to read your screen as we go forward. I will not be reading everything out to you directly, instead talking over the high points. So tons of myths exist about dyslexia. They have existed for basically forever. And unfortunately, I feel like dyslexia is something that should be so much more advanced in our level of education. So it's not that the research doesn't exist, it's that the dissemination of the research has not existed. So a lot of the myths that you see from the 60s literally still exist today. And here is just kind of a overview of the thoughts about dyslexia, as the decades have progressed. So just so that you know, the research specifically as it applies to dyslexia therapy has actually been around since the 60s. But in terms of widespread knowledge, this is where we're still at, unfortunately. One of the most cliche, myths is the fact that dyslexia is just letter reversals, or that it's a vision problem. So neither one of these is true. This is not the main characteristic of dyslexia, although yes, it does present itself, but it is also not attributed to a vision problem. It is also not a medical condition, which is something that I hear very, very frequently when I'm talking to different clients around the United States as to how the educational system in their state is handling dyslexia, suggesting it's a medical condition and they can't actually treat it. So this is not something, when you have dyslexia, you will have it for life. It is not something that you can outgrow. But what we do know is that we can definitely treat it through dyslexia therapy. Okay, next, this is the widely accepted professional definition of dyslexia as established through the International Dyslexia Association. So I'm going to go ahead and point out, please look at the bolded words, and I will break those down in just a second. But one of the main ones that I'd like to address is the fact that it is neurobiological in origin. So what this basically means is that dyslexia stems from a brain functioning issue or a brain wiring issue from birth. I will go more into how that looks, but that is one of the reasons that fancy neurobiological in origin term, which a lot of school systems are trying to pin it as a medical condition, but in my opinion, isn't everything. Okay, so this does show some of the primary characteristics of dyslexia, with a secondary consequence being, impeded reading comprehension. And that is because if you can't decode a word, you obviously are going to have difficulty with the comprehension piece of it. Students with dyslexia tend to have average to above average IQs. So it's not that they can't understand what's occurring in the text or be able to put that big picture together. The issue with comprehension has everything to do with the fact that they are decoding the words improperly. All right, so we're breaking down this definition. Let's go ahead and look at that sentence in the IDA official professional definition, saying that difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. So what's happening in the dyslexic brain is that the phonological processor is the piece of the brain that is not working or it's under functioning. And that component is the sound system of our language. So that ability to be able to connect it's the letter sound piece of it. And then obviously the phonological awareness piece, which is the precursor to all reading, the ability to recognize, hear sounds, manipulate sounds, all automatically within your brain. Children with dyslexia are not able to do this. One of the things that I really like to point out is that intelligence does not always lead to strong reading skills. When the piece of your brain that is supposed to learn, acquire that reading, knowledge with adequate exposures, when that piece is not working, then it doesn't matter how intelligent you are, you have difficulty acquiring those skills, obviously, okay? One of the things also I want to point out here is that it says phonological memory and rapid naming. And that is also because children with dyslexia tend to have weak working memory. And that is, they'll make halfway through the word and then they forget the beginning part of the word. So they have difficulty holding on to it when they are decoding. Also, they have difficulty with fluency as a result. Okay, so let's go ahead and just break the word meaning down. So it means difficulty with language or difficulty with words, from the Greek morphemes dys and lex. It is a specific reading learning disability originating again in the neurobiological differences and the way that the brain processes language. This is really important to understand, I think, when approaching your students, because it has nothing to do with lack of intelligence, lack of effort. It has nothing to do with the amount of exposures that they've had necessarily. It's just all in the way that the manner in which they need instruction. All right, we can go ahead and watch this video that I feel like is very, very helpful, and kind of taking some of my words and twisting them into another approach. And I'm going to need to change the share real one quick. Sorry, excuse me. Let's see. I'm screen sharing, but I need to change this. Let's just do it this way.
If you wear glasses or contacts, you must see this.
Please excuse.
A Japanese Nobel Prize-winning scientist in stem cell research, Shinya Yamanaka.
Take a moment to read the following. How was that? Frustrating? Slow? What were those sentences about? They're actually a simulation of the experience of dyslexia, designed to make you decode each word. Those with dyslexia experience that laborious pace every time they read. When most people think of dyslexia, they think of seeing letters and words backwards, like seeing B as D and vice versa. Or they might think people with dyslexia see saw as was. The truth is, people with dyslexia see things the same way as everyone else. Dyslexia is caused by a phonological processing problem, meaning people affected by it have trouble not with seeing language, but with manipulating it. For example, if you heard the word cat and then someone asked you remove the C, what word would you have left? At. This can be difficult for those with dyslexia. Given a word in isolation like fantastic, students with dyslexia need to break the word into parts to read it. Fan-tas-tic. Time spent decoding makes it hard to keep up with peers and gain sufficient comprehension. Spelling words phonetically like S-T-I-K for stick and F-R-E-N-S for friends is also common. These difficulties are more widespread and varied than commonly imagined. Dyslexia affects up to 1 in 5 people. It occurs on a continuum. One person might have mild dyslexia, while the next person has a profound case of it. Dyslexia also runs in families. It's common to see one family member who has trouble spelling, while another family member has severe difficulty decoding even one-syllable words like catch. The continuum and distribution of dyslexia suggest a broader principle to bear in mind as we look at how the brains of those with dyslexia process language. Neurodiversity is the idea that because all our brains show differences in structure and function, we shouldn't be so quick to label every deviation from the norm as a pathological disorder, or dismiss people living with these variations as defective. People with neurobiological variations like dyslexia, including such creative and inventive individuals as Picasso, Muhammad Ali, Whoopi Goldberg, Steven Spielberg, and Cher, clearly have every capacity to be brilliant and successful in life. So here's the special way the brains of those with dyslexia work. The brain is divided into two hemispheres. The left hemisphere is generally in charge of language and ultimately reading, while the right typically handles spatial activities. fMRI studies have found that the brains of those with dyslexia rely more on the right hemisphere and frontal lobe than the brains of those without it. This means when they read a word, it takes a longer trip through their brain and can get delayed in the frontal lobe. Because of this neurobiological glitch, they read with more difficulty. But those with dyslexia can physically change their brain and improve their reading. With an intensive multisensory intervention that breaks the language down and teaches the reader to decode based on syllable types and spelling rules, the brains of those with dyslexia begin using the left hemisphere more efficiently while reading, and their reading improves. The intervention works because it locates dyslexia appropriately as a functional variation in the brain, which naturally shows all sorts of variations from one person to another. Neurodiversity emphasizes this spectrum of brain function in all humans and suggests that to better understand the perspectives of those around us, we should try to not only see the world through their eyes, but understand it through their brains.
Okay. Okay, I'm back. Okay, some more facts on dyslexia. Oftentimes we hear the 20% of the population is dyslexic. It is a little bit less than that. But this kind of breaks out how many individuals, children and adults have dyslexia, and that it is found across all economic and ethnic groups. Dyslexia does not discriminate. It is equally found amongst boys and girls and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is really just kind of restating a lot of the things that the video said, but people with dyslexia have brains that function differently. And literally when we go in and we look at MRI studies and pictures of the brain, you can literally see the stimulation in the non-dyslexic brain, all the places that the brain is lighting up, whereas it is not happening in the dyslexic brain. And instead, you can see that that Broca's area is actually kind of overworking in order to try to compensate. And that's a really big thing that you have to remember with your students, is that even though you may see some reading progress, all of that is a result of the compensation that their brain is doing. So again, here is a more clear picture of that lack of activation that's happening. So this is a very, very powerful and important thing to remember. Like I was saying, compensating readers use a neurological detour to read, not using phonetic awareness, but relying on memory. So often what they're doing is they're seeing those words as pictures, for example. They are memorizing as much as possible, but this also helps to contribute to understanding why the sight words tend to be some of the most difficult ones, because those bigger words almost can be memorized because their shape is more unique, whereas your small little sight words, such as in, is, it, they all have very similar shape and structure, and so they're often interchanged. Okay, so again, boys and girls are equally afflicted. About 20% of all children have significant difficulty learning to read. But the prevalence figure varies according to instruction available to all third grade students. As you can imagine, the quality of the instruction varies between campus to campus. So even though they're having difficulty, when the intervention is provided in a more quality way that targets dyslexic students, we can kind of curb that. And when instruction is optimal, all but about 5% can be brought to the average range of reading. Okay, so some of the things that we see as primary symptoms of dyslexia: problems learning the letter names and sounds, difficulty in reading single words, such as on flashcards because they have no context around them, lack of fluency, reading slow with many mistakes, and difficulty learning to spell. Again, obviously, a secondary consequence is understanding what they read because they're decoding improperly, or they're spending so much time working on decoding, they are not holding on to what they have read, which I'm sure even as readers, we can reflect, and, as neurotypical readers, you can identify with that. And then the bigger picture, if we're having difficulty with spelling, taking all of that and composing sentences and paragraphs, understanding how the structure works, even down to the executive functioning it takes to be able to envision the structure of a paragraph or an essay. So one of the things that we really always like to talk about is that these difficulties are often unexpected in relation to other cognitive and academic abilities. This kid is brilliant. He or she is very articulate. They do very well in math. They do very well, especially when they can verbally express their understanding, but we just don't understand why it is that that reading and spelling component is so impacted. Okay, so unlike oral language, reading is not automatic and must be learned. Okay, so research shows that the brain learns to read the same way it learns to talk, one sound at a time. So when we are going back and providing that intervention, it is so important that we break it down into the smallest bits, ensure mastery before we move forward. So again, how common is dyslexia? 10% of the school-age population has dyslexia. 15 to 20% of the general population has a language-based learning disability. 70 to 80% of the students with specific learning disabilities receive special education have deficits in reading. So when we're looking overall at just specific SLD, that term, 70 to 80% of them, it's coming from reading. And dyslexia is the most common cause of reading, writing, and spelling difficulties. It is the most common reading SLD. How can I recognize dyslexia in my students? Obviously, a lot of the things that we've already discussed, but specifically learning letter names and corresponding sounds, reading words in isolation. Some of this is repetitive. Difficulty spelling and accurately and phonetically, slow, choppy, disfluent reading. Kids avoid reading aloud. They don't pick up a book for pleasure, and they have difficulty understanding the text, again, because of that slow and inaccurate word reading. So now I'm going to break it down into, based on age, what you can expect as red flags. So a lot of times in the schools, we wait until 7 to test for dyslexia. Some states wait even longer, but you can see characteristics of dyslexia, in particular in kiddos who have more severe, moderate cases of dyslexia. You can see it from the early stages. And a lot of this, especially as we move into kindergarten, has to do with that phonemic awareness. But difficult, like they were slow to learn to talk. First of all, 60% of kiddos with dyslexia also have speech impairments. These two conditions are very comorbid because of the piece of the brain, the language-based piece, of the brain that we're talking about. So a lot of times they're interpreting those sounds wrong even, and then that contributes further on to their ability to read and decode. Difficulty rhyming is one of the earliest signs that we see that help to flag us for a kiddo who has dyslexia. Difficulty with pronouncing words. So one of the most famous ones we always talk about as therapists is Pusketty for spaghetti. Poor auditory memory for nursery rhymes and chants. Difficulty learning vocab. They have trouble bringing words back. And, even just down to difficulty remembering the letters and their names. So another one of those things is that they really enjoy being read to, but when it comes down to you putting the pressure on them to identify any of those words, they tend to stray. So again, now we're talking about the actual piece of, and by kinder, we are starting to acquire reading skills. So they have difficulty hearing syllables. They have difficulty with manipulating sounds and symbols. So for example, breaking those sounds. There's so many components of phonemic awareness, but it would be things like being able to interchange the initial sound in a word. So say bat, now say bat with a k in the initial position, cat. And to be able to kind of switch that out, they have difficulty doing that. Their brain is not able to play with those sounds with automaticity at all. They also have difficulty breaking the sounds out. So for man, like I said on here, that's very difficult for them. They have difficulty isolating sounds in their brain. What's the initial sound of man? They have difficulty with that. Difficulty with the acquisition of letter names and sounds. And then obviously as we move forward in our reading process, they have difficulty with decoding words in isolation in particular, because they can't rely on any of the words that they've memorized around it to give context to the word so that they can guess appropriately. And then obviously, they have trouble spelling in general. All right, in second and third grades, everything that we've said before, but sight words are very difficult to be able to acquire. They often also exchange like a for like the word a for the, for example, also, because they're just assuming, they're not actually really properly reading what's happening on the page, but their brain is inputting what makes sense to them. Again, single word decoding. Difficulty remembering the correct sounds for like letter patternings and reading. So whenever you have a neurotypical reading brain, it starts to recognize patternings of letters. So it starts to recognizing the sounds that those digraphs make and so on. This is much more difficult for a child with dyslexia to do, because that piece of their brain that is supposed to be making those connections isn't able to do it. Okay, so as we move up in the grade levels, all of those same things are still occurring, but they also, in addition, that social emotional piece of dyslexia has started impacting them. They recognize the difference between themselves and others around them. So they don't want to read aloud. They avoid reading. Their vocabularies are not as developed as a result, because they have been doing less and less reading. So they may be very articulate and can express themselves in that manner, very well. And it seems that they're very intelligent, but why do they have a lacking vocabulary just in general? And they tend to, with everything else, if we're avoiding reading, we tend to rely more on listening. All right, so now I want to just kind of go in, after we've talked about the flags that we see, I want to move into identification, because as a teacher, you are probably going to be one of the first who is going to recognize this. I'm sure parents may have, if they're doing a lot of reading with their children at home, or they're talking about their struggles, they may have come to you also. But now that we've recognized and identified a kiddo who doesn't seem to be evolving as they should in their reading development, or they're really struggling specifically in the reading and spelling component, but for all of other reasons, they really should be excelling. As a teacher, you're the individual who is going to kind of lead the charge, hopefully, in the identification process. So one of the things, since I am making this video and it is targeted at states countrywide, I want to point out the fact that what you encounter in your school and your state may be different based on your specific dyslexia specific laws. So if you look at our website, we have gone through and literally rated every single state based on their legislation and progressiveness to help give you kind of a temperature for how your state specific dyslexia laws are, but they vary drastically. Texas and Arkansas by far are the country leaders in dyslexia legislation and how we handle it. That is where the majority of our therapists and myself are from. But when you look at other states, it is very different. So let me point out that all special education laws are considered to be federal, and every single state must comply by them. But when it comes down to the dyslexia specific laws, it's a little bit different. So when we're talking about special education, IDEA, they don't specifically say it is dyslexia, but they just use the umbrella term of a specific learning disability. So that's the coding for that. But they left it up to each state to develop their own dyslexia specific laws, which is why we see the disparity that's happening. It does not mean that we can't have treatment for kiddos with dyslexia countrywide. All right, so whenever I suspect a kiddo in my class has dyslexia, we first really want to look at the data, okay? So has that student had adequate exposure to education? Was the kiddo living under a rock, or received very little instruction prior to entering, say, kindergarten or first grade, right? Was this student not pointing in any fingers, but looking at all the different reasons that possibly a student might have come to me without that educational exposure. And that's the actual explanation for why they're having difficulty at this point. By the time that they are 7, all of those things really should click. Their brains are developed enough to have require less exposures to be able to acquire it if we have a neurotypical reading brain. So that's kind of what we're looking at. And then of course, it's along those same lines. We're looking at attendance and what kind of interventions they've received before. So at that point, once we've decided, yes, check, they've been at school, they've gotten good opportunities to close the gap. They've received quality education. Their teacher hasn't been out on maternity leave, their whole class has just been watching videos for a year. The next thing that we're going to do is we are going to administer a quick phonics screener. So you can find these a lot of times all over the web, but that can give you an idea when you're going through that phonics screener, that inventory, if they're missing a whole bunch of things, and it'll present you opportunities to identify deficits within the typical, dyslexic brain. This is not a formal battery, but this is just a quick, like it suggested, a quick phonics screener. It can show you if we have some big gaps that are just kind of surprising. Obviously consider tier 3, but do not waste time in RTI, because a lot of times a dyslexic, well, not a lot of time, but a dyslexic child really needs a multisensory approach. So if we continue, even just in small group, to give them a 2-dimensional approach, which is the classic approach to intervention, just to instruction, being audio, auditory and visual, they're not going, we're just going to kind of spin our wheels until we actually get good quality intervention for that child with dyslexia. They require a different approach, is what one of the biggest things that I need all teachers to walk away with, that understanding. So next thing to do, once we have kind of identified that there's probably a problem, is consider referring them to special education for dyslexia specifically. So I like to suggest that we avoid the 504 route, even though a lot of states try handling it this way. But because of the fact that under 504, they can have a, I'm blanking out, they can have an assessment that is just looking at dyslexia. It is often provided by a lower caliber of testing professional, depending on the state that we're talking about and what their mandates are. But whenever it's in special education, the testing professional should be, in theory, very knowledgeable, and it's going to be a comprehensive evaluation. Because one of the other important things to consider is that students with dyslexia, 70 to 80% of the time, they have some other comorbid condition occurring that might also be contributing to the big picture. So it's really important. Not only that, and obviously I'm a very large proponent of special education, but the students and the parents have so many more protections under the special education umbrella than they do the 504 umbrella. And we can really ensure that their accommodations and their instructional needs are individualized. All right, so when we're kind of looking, I'm just going to show you that if you were looking at a testing report that would come out as part of the full individual evaluation, you can kind of identify some of the key areas that help us to identify dyslexia when we're looking at the actual batteries. So the CTOP is one of our big dogs when it comes to dyslexia. Obviously, their phonological awareness is below average, their rapid naming, their phonological memory, a lot of those things that I already mentioned before. The Woodcock-Johnson is another one that we're often using, showing those deficits in decoding, word recognition, again, oral reading fluency, and spelling. Okay, so a lot of times also, obviously, this kind of just goes on about the reading comprehension. And the GORT is another one that is often utilized for dyslexia intervention. Okay, so something that I really always want to address when it comes to dyslexia is ADHD. So ADHD, just so that you know, hangs out with dyslexia just like speech issues do. So 40% of children with ADD, ADHD also have a comorbid dyslexia condition. But that does not mean that the ADHD is the reason that we are having deficits in reading. So can ADHD be the reason that this kiddo is lagging? Yes, that is true. My son specifically is an example of that. He does not have dyslexia, but when we medicated his ADHD, all of a sudden he was a top reader, whereas he was lagging so far behind in spelling and reading previously. He is dysgraphic though. Kids with ADHD, when prompted, can decode. They can pick their errors up. You know, they have better word calling when prompted, and that's kind of the key way to consider the difference, is that a child with dyslexia and ADHD just can't do it. They have difficulty with that. But when prompted, kids with ADHD can correct themselves, okay? So comprehension varies depending on their interest also. This is a disorder of self-regulation and executive functioning. It is not necessarily an issue with the phonological component of reading. All right, so how can I help a student with dyslexia in the classroom? So this is the part where we're starting to talk about different accommodations that you can provide. I do want to point out that when we're talking about in a testing or a grading situation, these accommodations technically do need to be documented in an IEP or 504 paperwork, so that we can properly, assess their understanding. But there's no reason that as we're in that process of getting that paperwork or suggestions for what we can write into their paperwork, that we can be providing these to help the kiddo out. All right. So one of the things is just teaching the why behind everything. School literacy programs are not developed with dyslexia in mind. Remember that everything, because that piece that would acquire it with automaticity is broken in their brain. It's not wired, or it's not functioning correctly. We do have to break everything down into the smallest pieces and explain, give a little bit more of a roadmap. Accommodations in general, I think that this is a great analogy, because of the fact that we cannot visibly see this disability doesn't mean that it is not as crippling as a physical disability. So accommodations in general, just think of them as a wheelchair ramp. Accommodations in general are helping to level the playing field. They are not giving them an advantage. Okay, so just to kind of go through some of the presentation accommodations that you can employ in your classroom: providing the audio version of text, fewer items on a page so that they don't feel so overwhelmed. There is less to actually have to decode on that page. Providing a designated reader, a buddy reader, somebody who is seated next to that child and with discretion can help that kiddo out a lot of time. Providing notes is very helpful, not expecting them to be note takers, especially if it has a future grade depending on it. And I also find that providing a child, if you already know what you're going to say, drawing out some kind of graphic organizer on a page where they just it helps with that executive functioning related to taking notes and that organizational skill that is needed for those taking notes, so that they just kind of, it doesn't feel so overwhelming in general. And this does not have to be something that you typed out on your computer. You literally, as a teacher, can lean over, draw some boxes that make sense. Maybe we're talking, talking about a general subject, and we just draw a main idea graphic organizer, so that they can organize their thoughts a little bit better. And then directions broken down into steps, I think, is really important. They're having difficulty processing everything. It's very overwhelming to be a student with dyslexia. So helping them out by giving them single step directions. So once they complete the first task, once they take out their paper, then ask them to take out their pencil, and then ask them to write their name, instead of giving them a sequence of 3 or 4 directions, and then they have to keep up with that. Remember, 40% of your students with dyslexia also have a comorbid ADHD or ADD diagnosis. Therefore, it's that much more impacted, and it's that much more difficult to process. Response accommodations, I feel, are very, very key when we're talking about a student with dyslexia. Remember, they have trouble with the reading and spelling piece. They don't have trouble with intelligence. They just soaked up everything that you said verbally. So it doesn't mean that but if provided solely the opportunity to prove their knowledge in a written form, then they're going to trip up. So consider letting that dyslexic child tell you verbally what the answer is. Maybe they draw a picture instead to explain themselves versus a pair, and then verbally explain the picture to you. If you think outside of the box, there's so many different ways for that dyslexic child to prove success. Dictate answers to a scribe if you must have it written. Why can't you just write it down for the child? Speech to text, obviously, as we're talking about assistive technology, word processing, and also reducing the number of testing items to prove understanding, especially when we're talking about spelling. Let's say hypothetically a spelling test. And hopefully we are just teaching one pattern that we explicitly taught the patterning rules to. So instead of giving that child 10 or 12 opportunities to prove the application of that spelling pattern, why don't we just give them 5 and share what those 5 are going to be ahead of time, reduce their spelling list, for example. That's just one example. Setting accommodations, close to the teacher, obviously, to avoid distraction. But then as we're looking at testing, a quiet area free of distraction so that they can focus that much harder, or a small group setting. Timing, especially in particular with testing, frequent breaks, and also the opportunity to complete a task, extra time to complete. I am actually going to just kind of share an analogy that I use a lot of times with my clients, and that is, keep in perspective when you're thinking about applying all these accommodations and how it is just leveling of the playing field. Please keep in mind that for a dyslexic child, reading in particular, reading and spelling, it's like, imagine if you had just learned to drive. You are driving a stick shift, which you're not hugely familiar with. You are driving this stick shift on the opposite side of the car as you're accustomed to. You are driving on the opposite side of the road you're accustomed to because you are in, say, Germany. All the signs are in German, and to exacerbate everything, you are actually driving on a small, windy road in the mountains. That is the amount of focus that it takes for a child with dyslexia to be able to give you output, okay? Remember that when you're thinking about it not being fair for all the accommodations that I'm providing. And it just goes to show you that much more why frequent breaks, setting accommodations, and everything else are that much more important during testing. Organizational accommodations, this just kind of plays into that whole, some of the things that I've already said, but also into that whole executive functioning piece that is also often compromised as a result of attention issues, but frequent use of graphic organizers, directions divided into steps. A visual checklist, I feel like, is really important when we're expecting organizational pieces to come out of the student, help them out a little bit, and time management prompts such as the timer. These are all really, really easy things that we can employ, and again, without a lot of effort as a teacher. Okay, assistive technology, again, just like any accommodation, which this is not a cheat. And I really like to think, guys, even as non-dyslexics, as adults, we use assistive technology continually. I know that I speech to text constantly. I know that it's easier for me a lot of times to record an audio message. I use my word processor. I use Grammarly all the time. I use Alexa all the time. These are all just pieces of the landscape now in our world. And remember that these are just going to improve as the children age. So why not let them use these things to prove their success? It's really important that not only do we wrap our heads around the fact that this is fair to implement for a child with dyslexia, because they need to not have such social emotional scarring of not being able to feel success. These help them to feel success, but it's also really important that we teach them how to use these things. It doesn't help to just write it into the special ed, to the IEP paperwork. We actually have to take the next step of teaching them how to use these things. And the technology nowadays is amazing. One of my favorites, you can see them all on the screen, but one of my favorites is optical readers, you guys, where you can literally just take your phone, take a picture of the text, and it reads it to you. Amazing what's out there now. Okay, so I'm going to try to speed this up for you so you're not exhausted, but I'm going to quickly kind of go through, okay, so now what? The child has dyslexia. How do we help? And what I will go ahead overall telling you is that as a teacher, you are a generalist. We do not expect you to fix the dyslexia. It needs to be a trained dyslexia professional. I will talk about the difference between dyslexia tutoring that's often received in the school, and dyslexia therapy, which on some campuses in Texas and Arkansas do exist. But some of the high points, early identification and treatment are important. So it is important that you guys as teachers are flagging these kiddos. And scientifically based research is what helps us to figure out what they need. It's not picking up just kind of just you can do your best and have your best intentions in mind, but generally teachers are not dyslexia specialists, so don't put that pressure on yourself. Instruction needs to be by a specifically trained person, such as a certified academic language therapist, a CALT. That is not a common term in a lot of states, but it is very common, for example, in the state of Texas. So just because we aren't in your state yet doesn't mean we're coming. So, and if I am at all involved in it, I'd like to change that landscape. So a use of a multisensory structured language program such as Take Flight or Basic Language Skills is how we do it. This talks about all the different explicit reading instruction. Remember, I was telling you we need to break everything into the why. This has, here you go. These are all the pieces that explicitly need to be taught to a child with dyslexia. Therefore, obviously, it takes a dyslexia professional to be able to understand this. So Orton-Gillingham, I like to explain to everyone, this is a very common term in association with dyslexia, but Orton-Gillingham is not a program. This is a methodology. Okay, so this is an umbrella term for just taking a multisensory approach to instruction. It has been around since the 20s. What it means is instead of the typical teaching fashion that we do, connecting auditory and visual, we are now adding in, to complete the triangle, the kinesthetic piece of it. Okay, so not all Orton-Gillingham programs are created equally. They are very different. Most of the things, if an Orton-Gillingham trained professional is on campus, oftentimes the requirements to become an Orton-Gillingham trained professional just in the program, in that instructional program, are very low. The barrier to entry is very low. So what is given in, if it's an umbrella term, it's really more of a building. A lot of the things that are provided in the school are down here, whereas a therapeutic approach is different. That's what Dyslexia on Demand provides. We did not create this dyslexia therapy and intervention. This is not some hocus pocus that the company developed. This is something that's been around for a very long time. All right, so they're not all created equally. On the screen, you can see the differences between dyslexia, what would fall under dyslexia tutoring and dyslexia therapy. One of the biggest differences between the two is that you have to be a certified academic language therapist in order to deliver dyslexia therapy. We are basically the highest level of dyslexia interventionist you can be. We've had years of study on the dyslexic brain and our therapeutic program. And the difference, I say, is dyslexia tutoring, which is typically offered in the school, is going to be a multisensory approach just to phonics. Oftentimes, especially for our kiddos who have more moderate to severe dyslexia, this does not really, this is not as impactful to the brain. Sometimes it is just kind of a band-aid or a more temporary fix. It is better than nothing by far, but it is not the same as dyslexia therapy. The point of dyslexia therapy is to literally help to create new neural pathways in the brain so that the kiddos can access the reading code. What we do know about the brain is that it has neuroplasticity. So the brain structure, even though those pieces of the brain needed to be able to read with automaticity weren't there at birth, it doesn't mean that with the right instruction, explicit, systematic, very high repetition instruction, that we can't create them. The only two therapeutic programs that exist are Take Flight, created by the Texas Scottish Rite Hospital for Children, and Basic Language Skills, created by Nyehouse Education Center. Excuse me. Okay, These are the qualifications it takes to become a certified academic language therapist. This is why they are not a dime a dozen. This is why they are hard to find. The majority of the training facilities are here in Texas. So this lends to why it is so prevalent here in Texas, but not around the rest of the country. It does not mean that we are not trying to get satellite training facilities on campuses, but we have to spread the knowledge that this profession exists. It's also, it's a national level certification. This exists out there, but we just need to teach and educate that there is a better approach than just Orton-Gillingham tutoring. Okay, so the mission that we have here at Dyslexia On Demand is to be able to reach every child, regardless of being in a state where their, CALTs are not prevalent. That's what's so important. We individualize to every single student because we're passionate about changing the landscape of dyslexia. Okay, I'm going to actually bypass. You have access to these slides and you can go and watch what we're doing. Actually, we'll do it. Hi, my name is Megan Pinchback, and I am the owner of Dyslexia On Demand, the premier provider of web-based one-on-one dyslexia therapy. We pride ourselves with connecting certified academic language therapists with students in need countrywide. The company was created with the knowledge of the number of dyslexic children lacking services and the exceedingly small number of certified academic language therapists existing in most areas of our nation. We hope to reach those children who otherwise would not have such access. Our philosophy is a child-focused one. We believe in exclusively taking a one-on-one approach to tailor to the specific needs of each child while maintaining absolute fidelity in the therapeutic program. We place a large emphasis on the social emotional impact of dyslexia on students. We hope to help them begin to honor their differences as a dyslexic individual so they proudly advocate for themselves and their needs as they grow. We are proud to currently have over 245 cumulative years of dyslexia experience among us and are ready to service your child, regardless of their geographic location. Please visit us at dyslexiaondemand.com to learn more about dyslexia advocacy, state-specific dyslexia information, or to schedule an initial parent meeting to see how we can change the life of your child. Okay. All right, let's move on real quick. Okay, just some of the high points about what Dyslexia On Demand is all about. We are exclusively one-on-one and CALT run. We are data-driven. We definitely consider the social emotional piece of dyslexia because we feel like dyslexia intervention is a three-pronged approach. It has to do with, we have to do therapy, but we also have to address the social emotional needs and impact of dyslexia on that child. And we have to be able to help with the accommodations to help to level that playing field. Finally, advocacy is a very large piece of what I do in my passion. Take Flight and BLS, like I said, are the only two therapeutic approaches to dyslexia intervention, and they are both considered to be 2-year programs. And the results of completing the program is that you can see the brain activity in an MRI is going to obviously, it now after intervention, it looks very similar to a child, a neurotypical reading brain child. Okay, guys, that is the entire presentation. I obviously cannot take Q&A since this is a recorded video, but I really do hope that you are able to gain a lot of understanding about how you can approach and assist your kiddos in your classroom. Thank you.